For years, the story was so simple, right? The electric car was the future. The gas engine was dead. Billions, and I mean billions of dollars from governments, from car makers, all bet on this one single inevitable outcome. But then, almost overnight, it felt like that whole story just shattered.
Let's start with a number, $19.5 billion. That is the mind-boggling amount Ford just admitted its EV plans were overvalued by. Now, this isn't just some boring accounting thing. This is a tremor. It's a huge sign that the very ground beneath the electric revolution is starting to crack.
So how on earth did we get here? How did a future that seemed so certain, so locked in just a couple of years ago, suddenly look so fragile? Well, that's the mystery we're going to unpack today. We're going to follow the clues to understand what really just happened.
All right, to figure this out, we have to start at the scene of the crime, so to speak. And the first clue is just the sheer financial wreckage that's been left behind, now that the dream of an all-electric future has collided head-on with reality.
And look, this is not just one company having a bad day. The crisis is everywhere. Ford's EV division, it's just hemorrhaging cash. GM is paying over $1 billion just to stop making EVs. Volkswagen is closing a factory for the first time in almost a century. Even Hertz, the rental giant, is running for the exits, dumping thousands of EVs because they cost too much to maintain. The pain is absolutely industry-wide.
This quote just puts it perfectly. This isn't a market slowdown. It's the unraveling of an economic illusion. And that word, illusion, that is the key. It suggests that the whole foundation of this EV boom wasn't nearly as solid as we all thought. Which, of course, brings us to our next clue.
So, if it was an illusion, how did it get built in the first place? Well, the answer lies in understanding that initial surge in demand, it wasn't exactly natural. It had a secret ingredient.
And that secret ingredient, it's not that secret. It was cold, hard cash. For years, government incentives, like that $7,500 tax credit in the US, were just pouring fuel on the fire. This created a boom for sure, but it was a boom built on a foundation of subsidies, not true organic consumer demand.
Let's just take Germany as a perfect case study. With a ton of government support, EV sales were looking great, strong, climbing steadily. On paper, it looked like a massive success story. It was proof that the all-electric transition was working beautifully.
But watch what happened the moment that support was pulled. The floor just fell out. Sales plummeted by nearly 40% almost instantly. It's the perfect illustration of the problem. The demand wasn't really for the cars themselves, it was for the deal. Once the free money disappeared, a huge chunk of the buyers did too.
Okay, so this leads us to the next critical piece of the puzzle. The auto industry built its entire EV strategy assuming they knew their customer, but it turns out they were only talking to a very small and a very specific group of people.
It all boils down to two very different buyers. First, you had the early adopter. These folks were generally wealthier, they saw the EV as a cool new piece of tech like an iPhone, and crucially, they probably had a gas car in the garage as a backup. Range anxiety? Not a big deal for them. But then, you have the mainstream buyer, the person who needs one car to do everything. For them, a car is a huge investment. Price, reliability, public charging, and what it's going to be worth in 5 years, that's all that matters.
And the data completely backs this up. A staggering 84% of early EV buyers in the US had their own charging setup at home. This was not your average person. This was a niche market with a huge built-in advantage, and the industry made the mistake of thinking this niche was the entire market.
And here's the kicker that makes everything even harder. While car companies were trying to reach that mainstream buyer, the average price of any new car just exploded. It jumped from $39,000 to over $50,000 in just a few years. So in a world with high inflation and high interest rates, trying to convince a financially squeezed customer to gamble on an expensive, unfamiliar technology, well, that became a nearly impossible sell.
So the demand was artificial, and the customer was completely misunderstood. But the deepest flaw, the real reason this is an existential crisis for so many car makers, is that the basic business model for EVs is fundamentally broken.
What we're seeing is a complete inversion of how car companies make money. For decades, the formula was simple. Big cars, big profits. Trucks and SUVs were absolute cash machines. But in the electric world, that formula is flipped completely upside down. The biggest vehicles are now the biggest money losers.
This quote just sums up the trap perfectly. To give a heavy truck or a big SUV a decent range, you need a massive, incredibly expensive battery.
The battery is the car. It's the heaviest and most expensive part. So the very vehicle that's supposed to be your profit engine becomes this giant financial black hole.
So here's the bottom line. According to the Boston Consulting Group, Western automakers are losing an average of $6,000 on every single EV they sell. Just think about that for a second. The more successful they are at selling their flagship EVs, the faster they lose money. It is a business model that is fundamentally, completely unsustainable.
So faced with this totally broken model, automakers are being forced to pivot, and pivot hard. The dream of an all-electric or nothing future is being quietly put on the shelf in favor of a much more complicated reality.
And that's why you're hearing about things like the range extender again. Companies like Ford are bringing this technology back, especially for their bigger vehicles. And make no mistake, this is a quiet but massive admission. It is the industry acknowledging that for their most important products, their trucks and SUVs, a pure battery solution simply isn't working right now. And just as the industry is scrambling to figure all this out, a completely new challenge appears on the horizon. A key selling point for EVs was always cheap electricity at home. But now, the AI boom is creating an absolutely unprecedented demand for power. We're talking about new data centers that need the equivalent of 23 nuclear power plants. This creates direct competition for electricity, and it threatens to erase one of the EV's main advantages.
So where does this leave us? Well, the EV revolution isn't dead, not by a long shot. But that simple dream of a rapid, clean, all-electric world, it has collided hard with reality. Economics, consumer psychology, and just plain old physics have forced a massive correction. The illusion is over. And the real question now isn't if we'll have an electric future, but what that slower, more complicated, and probably more hybrid path will actually look like.